Leonard Yerkes will be introducing Mr. Dan Sharp of the Eisenhower Foundation to share insight on a topic that many of us yearn for or are looking for. That being the topic of principle over party politics. Len, please do the honors of introducing Mr. Sharp.
Please help me welcome Dan Sharp.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Len, and thanks to President Paul Ishii and the Rotary Club for this very welcome invitation to be with you. It's a special honor and pleasure to speak to this club, a very prominent group, and to share the platform with such an impressive group of young people and other speakers. I am indeed proud to be part of your club activities for today. Wonder where... interesting. Okay, let's see what happened here. All right, okay. Our theme is, what can we learn from the legacy of President Eisenhower? And particularly, I want to emphasize for you the theme that he constantly made decisions based more on country and principle over partisanship. Perhaps there's some relevance for today. Now, a lot of people know Eisenhower as the general that helped to save Western civilization, along with Colonel Smart, from whom you've heard. But I think there's a lot of people who really don't know much about him, and if I may, I'd like to give you just a very short biographical summary. So he was born actually in Texas in 1890. He grew up in Abilene, Kansas, a small town that still is only about 8,000 people, and that really shaped his values. He frequently referred to the fundamental American values that he learned there that influenced him throughout his life. He went to West Point. He served in the Philippines under Douglas MacArthur, an interesting chapter that unfortunately we don't have time to go into. Most famously, he was commander of Allied forces during World War II. He returned to the United States as Army Chief of Staff for a number of years, and then he became president of Columbia University for 5 years, a very eventful period which I'll describe briefly. Among the distractions during that 5 years was, for 1 year, he became the first head of NATO. He then was president, as you know, for 8 years, and he died at the relatively young age of 78 in 1969. I mentioned the distractions. While he was president of Columbia University, he did a whole lot of other things. Most importantly for me was that he took off 6 months to go out and create the American Assembly that Leonard told you about. But also, President Truman persuaded him to commute almost weekly to work in the Pentagon as the acting chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And he was the first head of NATO. If you look closely, there's a picture at the bottom of Abilene, Kansas in the 1930s, long after Eisenhower had left. But it still looks the same, except for the trains and the cars. They are being replaced, but it's really a quintessential small town. And here's a picture of him being sworn in as our 34th president. It's important, I think, for perspective to share with you his major accomplishments as president. And this list is rather interesting in that, with the exception of 2 of the items on it, this was in a memo that Ike wrote to his friend and press secretary, Jim Haggerty, who asked him after he retired, what are you most proud of from being president? And I ask you to look at the list critically because 2 of the items on it were not on his list, but we've added them, and it'd be interesting if you can guess which 2 he left off. So, a little known fact, there are at least 4 occasions when he personally prevented World War III and nuclear warfare. And in each of these cases, he overruled, in most cases, the combined recommendation of his military advisors and his cabinet, and often his party leadership. It's an extraordinary story that is being unearthed through declassified materials from our library. He ended the Korean War as he promised during the campaign. He appointed Earl Warren as Chief Justice. He desegregated Washington using the Truman executive order and carrying it out. Open dialogue with the Soviet Union, I think many of you know that he sent federal troops into Little Rock, and that he got passed really the first civil rights voting protection acts in 1957 and 1960, created NASA, and gave a really memorable farewell address about which I'll speak in a moment. Now think for a moment, which two do you think he left off? Well, I am startled to tell you he left off the first and the last items, two of his most lasting contributions, and it's really interesting. Eisenhower was a very humble man, and that was both his greatest strength and his greatest weakness. He never pushed himself forward. He always worked behind the scenes and gave credit to other people. So let me talk about this wonderful man, emphasizing a series of stories that I would like to tell you that illustrate his applying principle or the benefits of the requirements of the country over partisanship. And as I do that, let me ask you a question to think about, and I'll come back to it at the end. Are you at all concerned that we have a dysfunctional government in Washington now? Well, let's think about that as we look at the stories of how Eisenhower led a truly functional bipartisan government. And I want to start with a story that is almost unknown. It's called the Bricker Amendment. And the reason the Constitution is there, for years, there was a very strong movement within Congress to restrict the authority of the President of the United States to negotiate treaties with friends or enemies. Then, as now, there was a lot of hostility towards international organizations, towards international treaties. The fear was that they would interfere with our sovereignty, read civil rights, and that they would encroach upon American rights. And so for years they had almost passed it. In 1953, in Eisenhower's first year in office, the amendment was co-sponsored by a majority of senators in the United States Senate. And I tell this story for a couple of reasons, because he was so concerned about this that he went to Congress, used all of his influence and power, and even though the majority of senators had co-sponsored it, got them to change their vote and not carry it out. Now, why did he care about it? Well, he was concerned that if this amendment were passed, number one, it would violate his second most important priority, which is defending the Constitution. I'll tell you what the first was, you can probably guess in a minute. But every decision he made was guided by a set of general principles. The second one was the Constitution. He said it will alter the balance of power between the executive and the legislative branch of power. Secondly, it will empower the isolationist movement within this country rather than our involvement with the world. He was very concerned about it. He said, third, it will deprive the president of the ability to provide global leadership. And so he exercised great influence and great power in getting Congress to reverse their inclination. And at the same time, he was able to convert, really to move the Republican Party to a more moderate stance. And when I spoke to David Eisenhower, his grandson, who is chairman of our foundation, I asked him how important this was. He said what it did is that it allowed him to create what he called the presidential wing of the party. Eisenhower's was the first of 6 Republican administrations. And David felt that one of the reasons for that was very important because he kept the party in an electable frame of mind. Okay, let me move on to the Suez Canal. Probably some of you remember that there was a crisis over Suez in 1956. First, let's look at what the canal is. The double yellow line is the canal, and there are 2 important things to notice about it. One is it's an open waterway. There are no locks like in the Panama Canal. But most importantly, it is totally within the borders of Egypt. And yet, Egypt did not own it. It was owned by a group of international countries for whom it was very important. 2/3 of Europe's oil passed through the Suez Canal. It was pretty vital to their economy and their survival. So what was the issue? It's important to realize what was happening in 1956. Eisenhower was recovering from a heart attack. He was also running for re-election, kind of busy and distracted. And he was trying to build a rapport with the president of Egypt, Nasser, so that the United States could broker peace between Israel and Egypt. Sound familiar? Then as now, and his way of doing that was he figured out what was most important to President Nasser. It was to build the Aswan Dam, this very high major project, the biggest project in Egypt's history. And so he offered Nasser that we would help finance it. While he was recovering from his heart attack, his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, went to see him and said, I can't get the votes from Congress to do it. And in this case, Eisenhower was weakened by his heart attack. He was not able to go to Congress and get them to reverse it. So he announced publicly that we were withdrawing our financial support for Nasser's high dam. Well, Nasser got angry. He got really angry. He took over the canal and sunk a bunch of ships to block his passage. Well, if you were Europe and Israel, what would you have done at that time? They massed an army and they started to invade Egypt. And it seemed pretty logical, except to Eisenhower, whose number one principle was no World War III, based on what he'd come out of. And he was very afraid that the Soviet Union was trying to move in and that they would attack and we'd have a nuclear war over it. So he used all the economic and political power that he could amass, and he persuaded, shall we say, he forced all the troops to withdraw and for there to be peace. Now, the consequences were, in the short term, for 6 months, the canal was still blocked while they removed all those sunken ships. But more importantly, I think the best way to summarize the impact was that while I was wandering around the internet, I ran into an obscure BBC interview with Anthony Eden. You may recall Anthony Eden was the prime minister during the war and was our ally. And the BBC said to him, are you still angry at President Eisenhower for not supporting his wartime allies in this great crisis? And Anthony Eden was quoted as saying, of course I'm still angry at him. He was our wartime ally. How could he not have supported us? But he did prevent World War III. And it led to the Eisenhower Doctrine, in which we replaced the Soviet Union's influence in the Middle East. All right, let me move to another more obscure. Well, let me read this quotation, because as you think about a good leader, a good manager, he always had these overriding principles. Number one is no World War III. And if you can read the quotation there from Ike, we believe that the power of modern weapons makes war not only perilous but preposterous, and the only way to win World War III is to prevent it. That was his overriding concern. Every one of his decisions you can track from these principles. And that leads us to the solarium room of the White House. That's what this is. And the story that I want to tell you is about what's called Project Solarium, because for those of you running organizations, companies, nonprofits, whatever, it's an interesting management tool. When he became president in 1953, the U.S. government policy towards the Soviet Union, our most strategic policy, was one of containment, a word you hear now in a different context with Iran. But that was our policy. The problem for Eisenhower was that his cabinet and his party leadership didn't like containment, and they wanted a much more aggressive policy. And there were two alternative policies under consideration. One of them was called rollback. This was the aggressive wing of the party that said, we must roll back the Red Army's presence in Central Europe by military means, by war, if necessary, to get them out of there. The other alternative I call red line, again, a term you're hearing in a different context today, because the recommendation of the plank of the Republican Party was that where the Red Army is now, we will draw a red line. If they move 1 inch past it, we will have massive retaliation with nuclear weapons if necessary. So one was aggressively isolationist, the other was aggressively militaristic. So here's Eisenhower with three different policies represented in his cabinet, in his staff, and in his plank. So what he did was, he in order to create consensus, like he did in creating the American Assembly, his same philosophy, he created three teams sitting in the solarium room. He invited the most able and enthusiastic sponsors of each of these three policies to come to the solarium room. He created three teams. He said, you have 6 weeks to use all the resources of the U.S. government. I want you to come back and make the strongest argument you can. He reconvened them with the entire National Security Council, and for 9 hours he sat there just listening, and at the end of it he stood up and spoke for 45 minutes, brilliantly summarizing everything that had taken place without taking notes. The group was astonished at how clearly he represented all of them, and he said, I've made my decision. Our policy will be containment plus, and here's how I'll balance the things. And he unified his administration and got rid of the dissension that was in there. So it's a great management tool. All right, let me turn to domestic affairs perhaps more briefly. And we will cover two issues where Eisenhower was regularly criticized for not applying principle over party. And the first one is civil rights. He was criticized for not using the bully pulpit to defend civil rights and for saying things that he said he didn't say, but he's been quoted as saying that were perhaps not appropriate. What I want to do is I just want to show you what he did and let you decide whether that's more important than what he said or didn't say. If you can all see this, we'll go a little quicker here. You can see the Civil Rights Act, the first black White House staff. Not only was Earl Warren key to the Brown versus Education decision, but so were the other four justices he nominated for the Supreme Court and all the federal judges. They were all anti-segregation. He desegregated all the federal institutions, established the first permanent civil rights division, most famously sent the federal troops into Little Rock, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So he's criticized for what he said or didn't say, but I ask you to see what did he actually do and decide whether or not it's a fair criticism. This is the front page of the New York Times on the day he sent the troops into Little Rock. And if you can read the headline, sent to Little Rock, Arkansas National Guard, he acted to avoid anarchy. Well, what he said was, I acted to defend the Constitution because the authorities in Arkansas were disobeying a federal court order. And that was his second highest priority, is defend the Constitution. And here is a picture of the troops leading the children in there. And you all know about the interstate highway system. He built a lot of the infrastructure that would cause him now to be criticized for a government being too large, but you can decide whether this has been helpful to the country or not in terms of our economy. Much less known is the St. Lawrence Seaway that was completed during his tour. And if you look, this is where the Seaway is. If you look what it did, it opened up all the way over to Duluth, Minnesota, and Chicago, and Detroit, all of these cities to international trade by ocean. Something that few people remember, but it's an extraordinary contribution. I mentioned NASA, but he also created the defense research arm, DARPA, under which later the internet was born. He doesn't take credit for it. It was after his administration, but he did create that. Now, let me talk about the most, really, the most serious criticism that a lot of people made of him. You probably all remember McCarthyism back in the 50s and what it did to the country. Eisenhower was very seriously criticized by everybody for not standing up against McCarthy. And especially during the campaign in Wisconsin. He had a paragraph in his speech in Wisconsin, which is the state from which McCarthy was the senator, attacking him and disavowing what McCarthy was doing, and he took it out of his speech at the last moment in the interest of party unity, because McCarthy was a leading Republican, even a potential candidate for president, and he decided that party unity was more important than the principle in this case. Unfortunately for him, this became known to the public, and it was really the low point of his campaign because he was accused of, why was this important? What was he accused of? Well, McCarthy was accusing George C. Marshall of being a traitor for selling us out on China. George C. Marshall was his mentor and friend and boss, and he did not stand up and defend him. So it was very controversial at the time. All I can tell you is that with a lot of recently declassified materials from our presidential library, there are new books coming out that are describing all of the actions in a very quiet, humble, behind-the-scenes fashions that MacArthur took that eventually led to McCarthy's downfall. So much so that one of the authors said he was acting like Don Corleone behind the scenes. And even Eisenhower in later years said, well, I do think I did something. I turned McCarthyism to McCarthyism. The seventh story that I want to tell you is just one sentence. There was a piece of legislation on the natural gas bill that it was Eisenhower's bill. It was passed overwhelmingly by both parties in both houses, and he vetoed it because he was so offended by the flagrant corruption and abuse by the lobbyists. He didn't want the American people to know that he would sign a bill that had that kind of unethical pressure. I don't know how many presidents today would veto their own bill. The eighth story that I want to tell you very quickly is about his farewell address. Here he is giving it. You all know about the military-industrial complex, but for me, even more important is that this is a message that speaks to us today. drive for balance, put national interest ahead of partisanship, and in all decisions consider future generations, not just serving the interests of today. The last story, the ninth story that I want to tell you, they're quick stories, to me exemplifies his compassion and historical brilliance. This is a picture of Eisenhower with Patton on their first visit to the Holocaust camp in Buchenwald. And what he said, but even more importantly what he did, to me is the character of the man. What he said is on the wall of the Holocaust Museum, and very quickly he said, "I went there so that I could personally testify if ever in the future somebody would deny this reality." How many people on their first experience of this horror would have not only the compassion but the vision to think that there would be deniers of it? He not only said that, he then ordered every photographer and journalist under his command to go to a Holocaust camp, take pictures, write up all the stories, anticipating what would happen in history. All right, so these are the stories that I told you very quickly, the 9 stories. Why am I telling you these? What's the relevance? Well, again, I went to David Eisenhower, my friend and advisor, and he said, "Dan, you can do no better than take a quotation from John F. Kennedy in that famous tour of the White House that he did on television with Jackie Kennedy, when he took a quotation from the wall of the National Archives, which basically says, history is not a guide to the future, but it gives us confidence about what we might do today. And so that's why we tell these stories, that his principles will live on. I think you'll agree with me that as you think about these stories, Eisenhower showed unique historical brilliance from which we can learn a lot of useful lessons. And that is, in effect, the mission of the Eisenhower Foundation. Very briefly, the summary, it was created in 1945, long before he thought about the presidency, by friends in Abilene to memorialize his military service. You can see when it was built. This is incidentally all in the brochure at your place, so I'll do it pretty quickly. Its focus was just on Kansas until last year. And last year, his 4 grandchildren went on the board and asked me to come down and help them set a new strategy, which was basically to transform it into a truly national educational foundation and be the primary vehicle, as we're doing here, telling the story of Ike's leadership and his values and principles. This is the campus. What's interesting here is not only that that's the museum, but if you look carefully over here, there's a little house where he grew up with 5 brothers the same size he was in 3 shared bedrooms, and they all became really very successful, including Edgar, who moved here to Tacoma with you all. This is the library, and it is an incredible treasure trove. This information is in your pamphlet as well, so I'll go quickly, but it is just an incredible treasure trove. Its one problem is Abilene, Kansas is not a destination. So the challenge for us is to digitize it, make it accessible so that you here in Seattle can access all the material as though you were in Abilene, Kansas. Our plans are to make this material and all of our education programs, 5-Star Leadership and others that some of you know about, available to all Americans across the country. We want to bring hundreds of teachers, scholars, and writers. 15 books are being published this year about Eisenhower. Virtually all of them were developed at our library, but we want to bring all the other authors. Challenge is few Americans know much about Eisenhower, and yet his message is extremely critical. So that brings me to my opening question. Are you still worried about our national dysfunctional government? Do you share my admiration for the way Eisenhower created a functional bipartisan government? Maybe you're asking how you can help us. If you share my admiration for how Eisenhower led, you may want to learn a little bit more about all the different programs we have and think about whether there are some of them in which you want to become engaged. The only way to do that is by talking with me or somebody else involved in the foundation. I'll stay around as long as any of you want to. I know we have to end promptly, but I'll be happy to talk to you. But let me just end by offering the following comment and perspective. Let me describe what we've achieved during the year that I've been the CEO and what we would hope to be able to say to you if you invite me back in 5 years to tell you what has happened to the foundation. In the first year, I raised almost $1 million, most of it from Seattle and the San Francisco Bay Area, I will say, that has allowed us to move from 2 half-time staff to 5 full-time professionals. And they are now developing a series of new education programs. We'll be developing a very state-of-the-art educational website, putting that all online. So if you invited me back 5 years from now, here's what I'd like to be able to say to you. We had developed at least one important program around each of the decisions that I mentioned and many others, that they were used in hundreds of schools and colleges and military academies like our present programs are used at Fort Leavenworth. I'd raised an additional $10 million endowment from a variety of sources of people who gained naming rights in the process. We digitized much of the most relevant material from the library. We'd held 20 conferences on lessons for today from Eisenhower's legacy around the world, including one in Seattle. Our first 2 will be in Washington, D.C., sadly, not Washington State, and New York in the beginning of next year, keynoted by Leon Panetta, the Secretary of Defense, and I think also Colin Powell. Fourth, that the country has begun to develop an awareness of how to move towards a bipartisan functional government. And finally, that the membership in the Friends of the Eisenhower Foundation has grown to at least 5,000 people with an average contribution in the hundreds of dollars. So, whoops. Thank you for this. And let me just add one more thing. If our 5-year vision of educating and inspiring Americans to learn from Eisenhower's legacy in order to lead to a functional bipartisan government is of interest to you, I would really like to start a conversation with you today, here, or soon. So I look forward very much to being in touch with you as you wish. Thank you very much for your attention, and I think we may even have time for a question or two.
That's correct. We have a few minutes for some questions for Dan. So,
Dan, we have a question here from Art.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm a loyal supporter of everything with the name Eisenhower, but I'm a little bit worried. How are you mitigating the difference between some of the Eisenhower family and the foundation over the design of the new memorial?
I thank you for the question as an individual, but I don't thank you as CEO of the foundation because we are nonpartisan and are staying out of that discussion entirely. I have a very strong personal opinion that I'll share with you afterwards, but officially, happily, the foundation has no role in that dispute.
Admiral Center?
I just wanted to say I couldn't help but think Jim Warren would have loved this presentation. God bless you, Jim.
We have a question for Pete, from Pete.
I wanted to ask about the president's association with Gettysburg. And when he left office, I understood that he and Mamie went to Gettysburg. And was that really the beginning of the national park there in Gettysburg?
I do not know. But I do know that they had, during his presidency and at other times, they had bought the farm there. And if you want a full story of it, David Eisenhower has written a wonderful memoir that I know you have read from what you told me before, called Going Home to Glory, which is a very moving story of his living with his grandfather during the presidency and thereafter, and how he even worked the farm at Gettysburg as a young man for Eisenhower. I don't know the relationship of their family home to the national park. I'm sorry. We're really focusing, at the foundation, we're focusing on the 8 years of his presidency and what the lessons are for today.
A question from Gordon.
Yeah, I enjoyed David Eisenhower's book you mentioned, but I've been wanting to read one great book on Eisenhower himself, and now I hear that there's 15 coming out, and I have 2 or 3 at home I haven't read. Is there a willingness on your part to suggest a book that's out or one that you're looking forward to?
Inasmuch as we've invited all the authors of the books I'm about to mention to our conference in various roles, please don't quote me as to which one I'm going to single out. One has a tendency always to recommend the last good book one has read, and the last one I read is the latest one by Gene Edward Smith. I will warn you, it's 800 pages, but every one of them is worth reading. If you want a shorter, more readable book, Jim Newton, who is a journalist on the LA Times, published one last year And I think the balance between the thoroughness of Smith and the perhaps slightly more readable, less detailed book by Jim Newton would be a perfect balance.
Mr. Kraft?
Yes, do you envision somewhere in the future where the foundation might be in position to serve as a watchdog to the two political parties and highlight specific examples that violate the Eisenhower principles?
I think I have to say no on grounds that we are, I mean, the foundation is a 501c3, but we exist to support and use the materials of a federal government organization called the Presidential Library. And I think we would probably not legally be entitled to do that. However, one of the projects that some of my advisors have proposed could do that. We could set up a separate independent project if we were able to raise the money for it. It is in a document that I can send you. I have described what that would be, and that would be an independent organization initiated by the foundation that would have as its standing members a group, in most cases, of recently retired major figures in business and government and education, who would convene much in the spirit of the American Assembly, but it could be in a quasi-watchdog sort of way, but it wouldn't be the foundation itself. We'd be happy to inspire it, and if you want to talk to us about how to do it, I do have a plan for that organization.
We have last question from David.
Could you speculate just for a moment about what would Ike do today to prevent World War III? Thank you.
I can speculate about how he would work his way through the issue, because I've pretty well given you that clue. His first principle is how do you avoid World War III, as I mentioned. His second principle is how do I defend the Constitution. And third is what is the best interest of the country in the long term. I think that's about all that I can say. He would, if you remember from his farewell address, which I really recommend to all of you, it's available online, it's available from us as well. Take the four principles that I mentioned for that. He would work very hard to make sure that we were economically strong as well as militarily strong, that there was a balance in our ability to sustain a balanced government. And he would also be sure that we were not overly spending on behalf of the current generation at the expense of future generation. That's as far as I can go. The facts of each case, we spent 2 hours last night over dinner trying to answer that question about Iran. Leonard Yerkes asked us to think about it. I think we decided that it was beyond us because there were too many variable facts involved. I wish I could answer it for you.
Seattle Rotary Online is made possible in part by a grant from First Choice Health, working with the Washington Health Information Collaborative to use technology to bring better health care to patients throughout the Pacific Northwest. First Choice Health.